On a Tuesday morning last January, a man in his late 40s walked into my shop with his truck running in the parking lot. He had left it out there, idling. He told me he always warmed it up for at least 15 minutes before driving in winter. He had done it his entire life. His father taught him. His grandfather swore by it. He was in for an oil change, and while I had the truck up on the lift, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The cylinder walls showed early signs of scoring. The oil smelled faintly of fuel, and the engine had only 62,000 miles on it. That truck was not old. It had not been abused. It was not a cheap build. It was simply the victim of a habit that millions of drivers practice every single cold morning. A habit they were taught with the best of intentions. A habit that made complete sense 60 years ago, and a habit that is quietly destroying modern engines one winter at a time. Today, I am going to break down exactly why warming up your car the old-fashioned way is not protecting your engine. It is accelerating its death. I will show you what is actually happening inside the cylinders during a long idle, why the logic that made sense with older vehicles is now working against you, and exactly what you should be doing instead. This is not opinion. This is engineering. And once you understand it, you will never look at that remote starter the same way again. Let me start with something most people never question. Where did the warm-up habit even come from? The answer goes back decades, before modern fuel injection existed. Up until the late 1980s, most vehicles ran on carburetors. A carburetor is a mechanical device that mixes air and fuel for the engine, and it did not have sensors, computers, or adaptive control. It was entirely dependent on temperature to do its job. In cold weather, the fuel inside a carburetor would not vaporize properly. It would drop out of suspension as a liquid and puddle inside the intake manifold instead of becoming the fine mist the engine needed. If you drove a carbureted car hard before it was fully warm, it would stumble, choke, stall, and sometimes refuse to run at all. Letting it idle was not just habit. It was survival. The engine literally could not function any other way. That era also shaped a generation of mechanics and drivers who learned that cold engines needed time before they could be trusted. That lesson was passed down like mechanical gospel, handed father to son, neighbor to neighbor, across decades of American driveways. And for a carburetor, it was absolutely correct. But here is the problem. Those carburetors are long gone. Every vehicle manufactured after the early 1990s uses electronic fuel injection. And fuel injection does not care what the temperature is outside. It has oxygen sensors, coolant temperature sensors, and an engine control unit that adjusts the fuel mixture in real time, making thousands of calculations per second from the moment you turn the key. The engine knows it is cold. It compensates automatically. It has been doing this correctly since before most people reading this even had a driver's license. So the problem is not that the warm-up habit lacks logic. The problem is that the logic expired and nobody sent out an update. Here is what actually happens inside your engine during a long cold idle, and why it is doing real damage. When you start a cold engine, the very first thing that changes is the fuel mixture. The engine control unit detects low coolant temperature, and it enriches the fuel mixture significantly. This is called the open-loop cold start enrichment phase, and it exists for one reason: cold engines do not combust efficiently. The combustion chamber walls are cold. The piston surfaces are cold. The intake manifold is cold. Fuel does not vaporize cleanly under those conditions, so the engine control unit adds extra fuel to compensate, running a much richer mixture than it normally would. In a healthy engine that gets up to operating temperature quickly, this enrichment phase is short. The engine warms, The oxygen sensors activate, the system switches to closed-loop control, and everything normalizes. That is the plan. That is what the engineers designed. But if you park that car in your driveway and let it idle for 10, 15, 20 minutes, something else starts happening inside those cold cylinders. The extra fuel that the engine is spraying in during that cold enrichment phase does not burn completely. Some of it condenses on the cold cylinder walls, some of it gets swept past the piston rings by the downward stroke of the pistons and ends up in the oil sump in the crankcase below. This process is called fuel dilution, and it is far more destructive than most drivers ever hear about. Fuel is a solvent. When it mixes with motor oil, it does not just thin the oil out, it chemically alters it. The viscosity drops. The lubricating film becomes weaker. The anti-wear additives in the oil get diluted and lose effectiveness. And because the oil is thinner and less protective, every metal surface that depends on that oil for separation is now experiencing more direct contact, more friction, and more wear than it should. Think about what those parts are. The crankshaft bearings, the camshaft, the piston rings rubbing against the cylinder walls. These are precision surfaces engineered to incredibly tight tolerances, and they rely on a film of oil that is often thinner than a human hair to stay separated. Take that film away or weaken it, and metal starts touching metal. Not catastrophically, not in a way you feel immediately, but quietly, progressively, in a way that shortens engine life one cold idle at a time. Research published in peer-reviewed engineering literature has documented that fuel concentration in the cylinder wall oil film can reach significant levels during cold start conditions. Other studies confirm that low engine temperatures are one of the primary drivers of fuel contamination of motor oil. This is not a fringe theory, it is documented science, and the damage accumulates. A single long cold idle does not destroy an engine. But do it every morning for 10 winters, and you are removing service life from an engine that was built to last for hundreds of thousands of miles. There is another layer to this problem that most people never consider, and it involves something called fuel wash. When excess liquid fuel condenses on the cylinder walls during a cold idle, it does more than find its way into the oil. It actively strips the lubricating oil film off the cylinder walls themselves. The very surfaces the piston rings are sliding against lose their protection. Argonne National Laboratory research, often cited by automotive engineers, has identified this as a real and measurable phenomenon. A mechanical engineer named Stephen Chiotti, who oversees combustion engine work there, has explained publicly that idling in cold weather strips oil from critical components like cylinders and pistons. Not eventually, not only under extreme conditions, but as a direct consequence of what idling a cold engine actually does. And here is the part that makes this particularly insidious. While the fuel wash is happening, the engine still feels completely normal to the driver sitting in a warm, idling car. There is no knock, no warning light, no shudder. The engine sounds smooth. It idles quietly. Everything appears to be fine. The damage is invisible from the driver's seat, buried inside the engine where only an oil analysis or a close look at the cylinder walls can reveal what has been going on. This is how habits that feel protective end up being quietly destructive. The engine does not scream for help. It just ages faster than it should. The second major problem with long cold idles is one that surprises even experienced drivers when they hear it for the first time. Your engine does not warm up during an idle. Not really. Not in any meaningful sense. When the engine is at rest with no load, it produces very little heat relative to its mass. The coolant warms slowly. The transmission stays cold. The catalytic converter stays cold. Even after 15 minutes of idling in your driveway, the actual working temperature of the engine internals The pistons, the rings, the cylinder walls is still far below the optimal operating range. You are not warming your engine up by idling it. You are extending the cold enrichment phase, prolonging the fuel dilution window, and keeping the oil thin and underprotected while simultaneously burning fuel and producing emissions that the cold catalytic converter cannot properly process. The engine warms up fastest when it is under load. Not aggressive load, not hard acceleration from a cold start, but the normal, gentle load of simply driving the vehicle. When the drivetrain is engaged and the engine is working, it generates heat efficiently and reaches operating temperature multiple times faster than it does sitting in a driveway. Toei Automotive, one of the most conservative automotive organizations in the country, has stated this clearly. Start the engine. Allow it to idle only for the time it takes to fasten your seatbelt, then drive gently. That is how modern engines are designed to be operated. 10 seconds, 30 seconds at most, then drive. Now I want to talk about the drivers who will push back on this because there is a version of the warm-up habit that comes from a more sophisticated place, and it deserves a direct answer. Some drivers, particularly those who have owned turbocharged vehicles or high-performance engines, know that oil pressure needs to stabilize before hard driving begins. They know that cold, thick oil takes a moment to fully circulate to all the critical components, and they are not wrong about that. Cold oil is more viscous, and in the brief window immediately after startup, lubrication to remote engine components like the camshaft, the valve train, and the turbocharger can be momentarily reduced. That is real, but the solution is 30 seconds, not 15 minutes. Modern multi-viscosity oils, the kind labeled 5W30 or 0W20, are specifically formulated to flow quickly at cold temperatures. The W in those ratings stands for winter, and it represents how well the oil flows when cold. A 0W20 oil circulates through the engine almost immediately after startup, reaching critical surfaces within seconds. The days of needing to sit and wait for oil pressure to normalize belong to single viscosity oils of a previous era. For turbocharged engines, the concern about oil circulation to the turbocharger is valid, but vastly overstated when applied to normal gentle driving. The turbo only spools up under boost load. A gentle cold start and moderate driving for the first few minutes protects it just as well as idling, and it gets the oil up to operating temperature faster, which means the oil is doing its full protective job sooner. The answer in both cases is the same: short idle, gentle driving, not extended idling. Let me address one more version of this habit because it comes from a genuinely good place. The remote start crowd. Remote starters have become incredibly common, and the sales pitch is obvious. Start the car from inside your warm house, walk out to a heated cabin and a defrosted windshield, and begin your commute in comfort. It feels like the smart, modern version of the warm-up habit. It feels like progress. But every minute that a remote start has your engine idling in a cold driveway is a minute of cold enrichment, fuel dilution, and oil film stripping happening without load, without the heat generation of real driving, and without any of the benefits that a short, gentle drive would provide. If you use a remote start for comfort, that is understandable. But understand what you are trading. Every 10 minutes of cold idle has a measurable cost inside those cylinders. Keep it to the minimum needed to defrost the windows and warm the cabin slightly, then drive gently. That is the balance. So, what should you actually do? The answer is simple, and it requires almost no change to your routine. Start the engine. Give it 20 to 30 seconds. Use that time to fasten your seatbelt, adjust your mirrors, and check your phone mount. Then begin driving, gently. Not aggressively, not at highway speed, but normally and calmly. Keep revs low for the first 5 minutes. Avoid hard acceleration until the temperature gauge has moved into its normal range. That is the entire protocol. The engine will reach operating temperature faster this way than it would sitting in the driveway for 15 minutes. The fuel dilution phase will be shorter. The cylinder walls will retain their oil film. The catalytic converter will reach light-off temperature and begin cleaning the exhaust properly. The transmission fluid will warm up and begin protecting the gearbox. Every system in the vehicle benefits from this approach compared to extended cold idling. If it is genuinely dangerously cold, below -20 degrees Celsius or -20 degrees Fahrenheit, a longer idle of a few minutes before driving gently makes reasonable sense. Block heaters are even better in those conditions, because they warm the oil directly without running the engine at all, eliminating the cold enrichment problem entirely. But for the vast majority of cold mornings, in the vast majority of climates, 30 seconds and a gentle start is the scientifically correct answer. The man with the 62,000-mile truck sat across from me and looked genuinely unsettled. He had been doing something his whole life that he believed was protecting his engine, and he was learning that it had been doing the opposite. He was not careless. He was not negligent. He was following inherited wisdom that simply had not kept up with the technology underneath his hood. That is the most important thing I want you to take away from this video. The warm-up habit was not wrong. It was right for its time, for the technology it was built around. Carburetors needed it. Primitive oils needed it. Engines of that era actually depended on it. But the engines sitting in your driveway today are not those engines. They have sensors and computers and synthetic oils and injection systems that were designed around a completely different operating assumption. And when you treat them like they are 1975 carbureted engines, you are paying a price they were never built to handle. 30 seconds. Then drive gently. That is what the engineering says, and that is what will keep your engine running clean, strong, and long past the point where the old warm-up habit would have quietly shortened its life. If this changed how you think about your morning routine, hit like so more drivers see it before they shave another 100,000 miles off a perfectly good engine. Subscribe if you want weekly breakdowns that put real mechanical knowledge in your hands instead of fear. And if you have ever been told to warm up your car by someone you trusted, drop it in the comments. Those habits run deep in families, and it is worth talking about. The most expensive engine damage is the kind that happens slowly enough that you never see it coming. Now you do.